Okay, let's say you're trying to figure out 200 and you're trying to figure out your gas mileage, right? And let's say that 245 represents the the amount of miles that you have driven, right? And 19.5 represents your car's fuel capacity, right? But let's say you're having a hard time, like me, understanding how to divide 245 by 19.5 because of this lousy fraction, right? So this is giving you a heartache. You're trying to visualize how to understand, what's going on here. So you have how I visualize it. Well, first of all, if we divide this equation here, 245 divided by 19.5 gives us 12.5645, right? This top number here, right? This top number here. So that means to me, that basically means that if I were to divide this whole number right here, this block here, this whole block into 19.5 parts, these little blocks here, these are 19.5, 19 point and a half blocks, right? Each one would contain 12.5645 miles. Now, if I were to add all these together, so I went 12.5641, 12.5641, 12.5641, 12.5641, 12.5641, then you would end up with the equivalent of 245 minus your half, which would be your remainder of 6.2821. The same applies if you subtract. If I graph my number of miles, 245, and then I start to subtract 12.5641 from it, eventually I'm going to be left with my remainder, which represents my half, by 62821, right? So the initial problem here was trying to understand how to divide 245 into a fraction, right? If I divide 245 divided by 19, a whole number, we get 12.89, about 12.8947, right? Which is easier to understand because it's just, I know that every gallon gives me roughly 12.8947, or about 13. You could round it up to the nearest 10, which would be 13 gallons. 13 gallons, 13 miles per gallon, right? But it could be confusing if you have a 0.5 and you're trying to, okay, I know each chunk is equal to this number, this chunk is equal to this number, this chunk, and you can count it until you get to chunk right here, number 19, right? But then if you have this, it's like, how do I think about this fraction here in terms of this, right? And it's just, it's basically just this, right? The 6 to 21, which is half of this. So you would just count until you hit your half, and then you just add this, the difference. And you know, yeah. So if you think it's hard, it was confusing for me when I tried to get those 204 parts, and then I think about it. Well, okay, I take 12.894. No, sorry, the top number 12.5647, and I keep putting it inside, right? These chunks until I get to my fraction here, my half, and then you can no longer put 12.5641 into this half. So how I visualize it, right? My thought process out would help me was to think of this as wholes. Like instead of like the fraction, it's like almost like water. The miles represent like water, and you're like pouring it into these equally until eventually you're left with the half, and you're left with only 6.2821 of your total number, right? So practically, if you were trying to solve a problem in real life, let's say you had these amount of miles, right? And you were trying to determine how many miles per gallon you had, right? For here, um, how you can visualize it in a practical way, I think, is that you could have your 245, and that represents an amount. Okay, I want you to imagine like almost this could be like water. The miles are like water or a liquid, right? And that liquid represents an amount, in this case 245. And you have these containers. You have 19.5 containers, and you want to pour, what division does is that you're pouring that water equally into these containers, right? So you start one, you pour 12.5641 um, gallons, miles into this gallon container. Then you pour 12.5641 into of miles into this container, and you keep doing that until eventually you get to 19. And if you only had 19, then each container would have 2.56947, right? But then since you have this other half, you're going to be left with 62821, which, and that's the remainder. You're going to pour that amount of miles into that container right there, right? And another thing that was confusing to me is like, okay, well, if when I have 19 gallons, I could divide them into parts of 12.8947, right? But here I divided into parts of 12.5641, so therefore that's a difference of 3306, right? So that's another thing that confused me. How can you like if that's the difference and point 0.5 is my difference, 33 what does 3306 have to do with that? You know, but if when you think about it, right, if you're pouring this amount into that amount, I feel like kind of this point 0.5, the difference of the 19 here kind of just gets distributed in a small amount to each one of those. So that just breaks down into that until you have like equal parts, right? So yeah, that's my the like my thought process for this equation here.